Welcome back to the Regeneration Podcast, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, I am your co-host, Michael Martin, looking across the internet to my friend in New York, Mike Sauter. How's it going, Mike?
It's going really well. I'm kind of on a few vacation days here going into the weekend. My oldest son is visiting from the Columbus area, and we're going to launch right after this podcast. We're going to launch a little sunfish, those tiniest of sailboats
Mm.
Ah,
on
yes.
Hemlock Lake. It's called one of the little lakes or the Finger Lakes. There's no cottages on it. There's bald eagles and loons. Um, but there's
Nice.
hills, so the wind there is tricky, but Peter and my youngest son Aiden and I were just going to try and launch this boat today, so that'll be
Very
fun.
cool.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, so we have a new sponsor for the show.
Is that your
Oh,
mead?
This is not me. This is uh what is it? It's Spruce Beer
Okay,
cool.
say more.
that I made. So from one of our guests and friends, and one of my best friends forever, Therese Schroeder Sheeker. I think I mentioned this last time.
Oh, wow.
She sent me this for
Awesome.
my birthday, sacred and herbal, depending where you're from, healing beers. And and speaking of, remember the polka, "In heaven there is no beer."
Yeah.
Mhm.
In heaven there is
There
no
ain't
beer.
no beer.
That's why
That's
we drink
why we
it
drink
here.
it
Right,
here.
right. That's right.
And when we're gone
So
from here, our friends will be drinking all our beer. That's the
Mike
final
Sauter
thing.
will be drinking all the beer,
And then you
right?
say one more
Yep.
time. Yeah.
But it's good. It's actually pretty low alcohol, probably 4%. But it's made with molasses as a sugar. So it's got a little bit of a molasses taste, but it's got this kind of weird spruce effervescence.
Wow. And
So
her book is recipes?
it's a
Uh,
all kinds of stuff and kind of like mystical philosophy about all this cool stuff.
Oh, amazing.
is that her book or a book she sent to you?
She sent it to me from her birthday, but she didn't write it. It's
Yeah.
Oh,
by
okay. I see.
Stephen Herod Buhner.
Okay. And then you made your own, Michael? You made your own
Yes.
Bruce beer? Okay.
And actually, next up, probably tomorrow, since it's supposed to rain, I can't do any farming. I will be making ginger beer,
Oh,
which sounds good, right? So
yeah.
I'm up for the summer holidays. But
There you
anyway,
go.
today we're here, and I don't know if I can find it on my phone. A few weeks ago, out of the blue, I got a text from one of our guests today. Can I find it? There it is.
Monks, Trappist monks make beer too, I should have mentioned.
That's
That's
right. Because God wants us to be happy. That's why.
Mhm.
Uh, mm, mm, mm. I
I didn't
can't
even know where
I
you're
can't
going
find
with
the
this, which
exact
is
one, but
great.
Jamie asked me,
Okay.
and I think I called her right away, if I had encountered anything, you know, in the landscape on the divine masculine recently. And I said, I'll call her right now. And we had an interesting conversation, and she said that she had been encountering this in her practice as uh, a psychotherapist, and her husband David had also been encountering the same thing, whether it was through psychedelic enhanced therapies or dream work or whatever it happened to be. And I thought, wow, this is something we should talk about. Now, Mike, you have, was it two boys and two girls, right?
I do. Yep.
And I have six boys and three girls. And the question of course, you know, who you're, what podcast you're listening to. This, the divine feminine is a big thing over here, but
Yeah.
not to the detriment of the divine masculine. And I've been reading, people who've been reading my blogs and my Substack for the last couple of years. It's a theme that keeps coming back for me. Is is there a Christian masculinity, or is there a possibility for a Sophianic knighthood? Right? And there is nobody better to talk to about this topic than our guest today, David and Jamie Kohanyi, who live in the San Diego area, where what was you describe how May is in San Diego?
May
May
gray, May
and
gray
June
And June
gloom.
gloom.
bloom.
Wish
Huh.
they all could be. No. So
I just thought San Diego was the idea of perfect all the time, literally every time, everywhere,
that's
perfect
what
all
I
the
thought.
time, everywhere. Yeah.
Actually, one of my best friends growing up was from San Diego.
Got
But
a
anyway,
cousin who lives there.
um, so let's just start right there. So what is it that prompted this inquiry, and
First,
what
tell me a
came to
little bit
this?
about your backgrounds again, too, for me. Now, I listened to the first podcast with you, Jamie, but David's going to be new to our listeners. Yeah.
Okay, okay, go ahead.
Oh, you could go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my background is I'm a psychotherapist here in California, and I trained primarily through a transpersonal model. So I studied at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where
Feather in
the
your cap.
yes, thank you, where the emphasis obviously is a kind of transpersonal mythopoetic view of the psyche. And then prior to that, I was at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which is an institute that was pretty groundbreaking in terms of non-ordinary consciousness and curiosity about ranging from psychedelic experiences to paranormal experiences, and trying to make sense of what are the bounds of the psyche that we have and that are neglected by mainstream medical model psychotherapy. And then I did some work as well through a lot of art therapy and expressive arts therapy trainings and orientation. My background is as a musician. And so I originally got into this work through the arts. And so that training was done through an institute out here called Sky Mountain Institute, which is a very small institute that is eco-psychological. So its premise primarily is that what we kind of will call distress or disease in people that we see as primarily existential distress from the dying of our planet, right? And so these are the kind of different streams. I spent a small period of time in my undergraduate studies, though they were really influential to me in the world of anthropology. So I thought for a moment there that was the direction I was going to go on. But I'm primarily interested in healing, and which is what brought me into interest in Christ.
Yeah.
So that's as best as I can in a brief period of time, giving you a little bit of background about me.
That's
So
totally wild.
yeah, it's pretty
Yeah.
wild. And so
It
here
is.
in California, I, like David, we both see patients. In my actual practice, I do a lot of dream work and artwork with people. And then I also do some ketamine assisted psychotherapy. So
Huh.
that's using psychedelics to access imaginal and in my opinion, transpersonal material. And
Well, good summary.
lots of overlap in many ways between
Okay.
us.
Yeah, I mean, our lives overlapped when we met in grad school. We met at Pacifica Graduate Institute when I was about 23 and Jamie was about 29. So now we're a bit older than that. Um, so that we overlapped there, but I would say Jamie and I have Jamie's my soulmate. We've been together basically since the first day that we met. I mean, we clicked in a magical way, and I feel like a lot of my our theoretical interest in the masculine and the feminine is informed also by the things that we've learned together and grown in together in our relationship. So I feel like the relational part is a big deal. And Jamie's always been a very challenging partner for me in the best possible way. Like I feel like she's always led me to inquire about things I wouldn't have thought of otherwise. She's challenged me to see things differently. Um, anyway, so I guess the background, I guess to say for now. So I work as a psychotherapist as well. I'm an MFT, a licensed marriage and family therapist. I work with a variety of different kinds of clients, but I'm especially interested in men's issues. I do work with people with anxiety and depression and ADHD, sort of the most common reasons people would come to therapy. interested in grief. I'm interested in trauma. There's all kinds of things that I work in and want to keep learning about. But for today's purposes, yeah, it's the men's issues that are really close to my heart. And separate from my work as a psychotherapist, about a year and a half ago, I started being involved in a community called Sacred Sons, which is sort of a modern, the most contemporary version of the mythopoetic men's movement. They do weekends and other kinds of gatherings all around the world. And that's been really transformative and really helpful for me and made me really passionately interested in issues about male maturity and about fatherhood and about what masculinity looks like in our time, or what it could look like in our time. And crucially, I think that I begin from this point of view that just takes it for granted that that's all okay. There are a lot of people who hear masculinity as something that's inherently threatening, or bad or dangerous or in need of tremendous revision. I think I agree that it's in need of revision. We'll get into that later, but I think that there's a lot of good. There's yeah. But to get back to the biographical stuff, yeah. So I guess as a psychotherapist, there's that part. I've also just always been interested in religion. I would say my spiritual, curiosity started as a small kid. Actually, I was raised in a totally secular household, but I became interested in Eastern and Western religious ideas in my teen years. And my undergraduate degree is in religious studies, and I've never really given that up. I've always been interested in spiritual life, in comparative religion, in mysticism, and spiritual practice has always been something that is at the core of what I care about. Yeah, I guess that's good enough for summary
Well,
for now.
that's
Cool.
wonderful. Now, interesting. You make me thinking when you're talking about men's issues and stuff. And this is BC, before children. I've had children for 34 years. Um, I met, I went to it was actually just a random pop-up poetry reading by Robert Bly at this little cafe in Ferndale, Michigan. And I was probably 25, 26 maybe. And it was really wonderful poetry. I think it might have been the first poetry reading I really went to. But this is when he first started to talk about men's issues, before it kind of became a kind of cultural phenomenon. And I don't know if it did, but a lot of people made fun of it. But at this point, though, and actually I talked about this with Martin Shaw not too long ago, because he was kind of tutored and mentored by Robert Bly later. And it was a weird thing for me because I had never heard men talk like that. And when I talked to him after the reading, and I actually have bought, and I don't know where it is, it's someplace in the house, basically a pamphlet of the first chapter of what became Iron John. It was long before Iron John was published, that he was selling as just like a pamphlet. Well, I think it was $3, and he signed it, and I have it someplace. But I remember thinking when I talked to him, this is the first. I mean, the way he looked at me and the way he took me seriously, it's like, wow, this may be the first time a real man, adult who wasn't my father or somebody related to me, took me seriously. And it was kind of transformative, just that little moment, right? And so probably ever since then, this idea of what is it to be a man in this very sick Western society that we inhabit, and the same thing with a woman too. I mean, we can just, you can't avoid the rampant pathologies when it comes to uh, gender and sexual identity. It's just surreal, right?
And I think this is a good spot to start to weave the foundation of Jung into this conversation a little bit, because I think the first question is, if we're here talking about masculinity, why is there this woman on this call? Why am I here? And this gets to what Jung really believed about how men become men. and that my very presence in the room, as a feminine presence in this room, is an activating principle in the masculine, in what I believe as a Catholic, both externally in real material life, that there's something. And for Jung, he was looking more intrapsychically. What does a feminine presence do to masculinity? And so I'm sure the three of you can reflect on it, brings out the best and the worst, doesn't it? Right? To have a woman present. It brings out the full polarity. And it does the same for me, having the three of you here. Right? And so Jung was very interested in what is this that is happening for us intrapsychically. And recently I came upon this stages of development that Jung said we could see in a man by the way he relates to a woman. And it's that he will project his internal feminine, his daemon, his soul guide onto the woman in his life. So the first woman you're going to project onto is mom, because it's the one you came out of. It's the one, if we are fortunate, we have. And he says that our first experience of the feminine is as the ever-flowing breast. That's what we think women are. They're here to take care of us. They're here to nourish us. They're here to make me feel comfortable. And part of what I see in our culture is that a lot of men never develop actually past that point, that they're really interested in women for gratification, comfort, nourishment, support, and that is never not a piece of the feminine, but it's a dimension. And so he says that the next projection that a man will have is usually a Helen of Troy type of woman. She's amazing. She's incredible. What a paragon of intelligence and talent. This kind of increasing respect that we see. And so it guys kind of goes from Eve to Helen. And this is where I think, Michael, you would find this interesting, is the third projection is Mary, is paragon of goodness and virtue, right? But his highest is Sophia. That the highest projection is what he now calls the ability to completely not objectify. And that the opposite of love, in many senses, I heard recently, is use. And that the highest amplification of masculinity in Jung's perspective is the inability to use people. And this to me is so foundationally Catholic, right? This is Catholic social teaching at its highest, right? Is that we're always looking for where we're reducing people to an instrumental use, right? So I wanted to kind of put that out there and then give you guys.
And I'd say our culture is all about instrumentalizing people.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And I, as a woman, have to be very careful not to see myself that way, or else that would bring out the very worst. And to also, it's very complicated, you know, because a lot of what it means to be female for me also has to do with allowing myself to be experienced. So it's a tricky thing. How do I be experienced but not used?
Jamie, do you think it's a kind of a quick question maybe, but you know, I've thought we learn about things from their opposites, of course. You know, so again, during the Trump campaigning, you know, love trumps hate. That I was always that led to so much tribalism that a lot of my writings and things, you know, I was fond of quoting St. Paul, who said, perfect love casts out fear. So you could get a sense that fear is opposed to love. And boy, that opens some doors. Now you're saying kind of the opposite of love is use, of just like, as, you know, and between David and you, is there an interesting way to kind of link up fear and use? You know, because Michael was, this whole world is dedicated to instrumentality. This whole world, everything is objectification. But just briefly, you know, do you see something between like use and fear?
That's a great, I think you definitely could. I mean, I think if the mindset is about acquiring as much as you can, right, as a human being, or if it's about protecting yourself against other dangerous people, I guess you would have kind of a more of a sense that you need to, yeah, you're not in a position where you are beholding or appreciating. You are securing things for yourself, and you're
Right. That's right. Grasping. Yep.
yeah. Um,
Mhm.
So, but I think love is multidimensional. So I think that the opposites will be more than one thing too, right? So that fear
Yeah.
is
Right.
the
Right.
opposite
Right.
of love. I like that. And use is in some sense could be seen as the opposite of a loving way to interact with someone or something.
Oh, and
Yeah.
I think that's very masculine and feminine too. That I think that the masculine is often oriented to the principle and the woman is
Mhm.
often oriented to the person, right?
Mhm.
So when I think the opposite of love is use, there's this relational dimension around that I think that I'm aware of, right? And
Uh-huh.
I think what you said is true. Love is a I mean, God is love. There's a
Yeah.
lot
Right.
of
Right.
things
Right.
that are going to exist in polarity potentially to that.
Yeah. And maturation is going to be a big theme, presumably, for all of us in this conversation. What is it? What does look like? What does love look like? What does masculinity look like? What does femininity look like? Interesting.
As it
Well,
matures. Yeah.
Yeah, right, right.
I think
100%.
well, so let's I mean let's get let's cut to the chase. So Jamie, when you contacted me like a month ago or whatever it was,
Yeah, yeah.
what was happening?
Yeah.
What were you seeing, both of you in your practices, that this became a question?
Well, the first thing that I was seeing was as David kind of got involved with men's movement work, all of a sudden it was like I in and granted I'm in the micro population of SoCal, right? All of a sudden, so many women in my community, their husbands are doing men's work.
Mm.
And I was like, oh, of course this is happening. Because, of course, as you have one person in the relationship grappling with their own femininity, if that's my female friends, that's going to have a syzygy, it's going to have a counterbalance, right, in their significant other. And so there is a moment right now that's really happening, it feels like out here, of um, this kind of increased interest in men coming together and exploring what does it mean to have and I think that's how this term divine masculine comes to be, which is sort of um, I would argue that Jung would say the divine masculine is the integration of the feminine in a man,
Mhm.
right? That
mm,
it is the integration of the soul. And I mean, Jung used to say directly, he had a very gender polarity kind of vision on the world, that he would say the most masculine man has a feminine soul and the most feminine woman has a masculine soul, that this um, dynamic that is working in the person between their ordinary ego consciousness and this mysterious force inside of them is what brings people into healing and wholeness.
Right.
And so, I mean, we could go in a lot of directions with that, but there was something you were going to say.
mm. Um, yeah, I think that is interesting. I mean, I guess in the worlds that we are in here in Southern California and as therapists, I would say that a lot of like the men's work and the men's groups that Jamie's talking about would be ones that would be, let's say, like adjacent to or kind of woven into the world of psychedelics, of men who are interested in personal growth, in kind of alternative spirituality,
Alternative medicine.
alternative
Yeah.
medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that like, and I think that is one strand in some of the current interest in masculinity or in men's work. Maybe we can come back later to other, let's say, I don't love this word, but let's say more conservative versions of masculinity. Because I don't think it's a terribly useful word here, conservative. It's not conservative versus liberal, but maybe there's also concerns with masculinity that are evident in how many churches have men's groups, right? Like that's and they're occupying a very different cultural space and they have different concerns. I would, in my experience, I would have see a lot of those also not getting as comfortable with integrating the feminine. What I
Exactly.
mean by that is like in a lot of the men's spaces that Jamie and I are referring to, There are men who are looking into each other's eyes, holding hands, hugging, singing, dancing. It's physical, it's intimate, it's emotional, there's tears. And it's in a way, they're men growing into their manhood through this open-heartedness, right? And through this kind of softening. That's part of it. That's not the only thing going on. It's also, to return to your point, Michael, Michael Martin, that is, this has always been something that people can make fun of easily, right? Like there was this caricature of Bly and all this and the mythopoetic men's movement after him, of just like shirtless men painting themselves and drumming in the forest and stuff. It was always something that could be made fun of. I think one thing Jamie and I have in common is um, we're less interested in ridiculing something and more interested in trying to really understand what the deep wish is there. What are people trying to discover, or what's the real yearning that's present in something like that? So yeah, I think that's I forgot what I perked up at.
Well, let me throw this in. So what I think when I met Bly 30 some years, 35 years ago, probably, what I think he was noticing is that, and I think our culture did this, and I think probably started, I mean, it was a reaction to to the kind of rigid psychology of the 50s and earlier, but it went into a polar opposite direction, and he was noticing what he called the soft male.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I'm interested in this too.
well, and it made a lot of sense to me because even I remember seeing an interview with um, Joseph Campbell talking about men who had been through a lot of therapy. He said they got nothing to them. They're like filleted fish. There's no drive. There's nothing, you know what I mean?
And
And when I talked to Bly, it made me start thinking about those kinds of things. But I think the point that he was talking about it at all suggested that something was wrong, right? That the situation was pathological. And I think it hasn't gotten any better. I mean, culturally, it hasn't gotten any better. You certainly have pockets here and there where there's light and hope. But and when the whole trans thing really blew up a few years ago, I remember thinking, this is so not the way to integrate the anima or the animus. This is trying to do that through mechanical and cosmetic and surgical means, and it will never happen. These people will never be happy.
well, I think the parallel process that caused the softening of men during the Bly movement was contraception.
Mhm.
Wow, right.
Wait a
Because,
second. Let's hold on for a second right there. Because boom. Okay, we continue.
Say more,
because
yeah. Yeah. It's great.
female fertility being in the game makes men men.
It makes them behave too, right?
It also makes them rise because they have to be an example. They have to become somebody they need to live with through the eyes of their own child.
Mhm.
And so when we throw contraception into the mix of man feeling their hearts,
Mhm.
so now what am I available for? Nonstop use.
Exactly.
Right? And so if the natural consequence of becoming intimate together is that a child is going to come, that invites a certain amount of development in us as human creatures,
Mhm.
right? And so
Right.
this development that I think that Jung had in mind was in a certain ecology of men and women that was not happening. It's not happening now. I mean, it's happening. The craziest thing out here now is my friends who want to learn NFP are hippies now.
Yeah, right.
My non-Catholic friends are coming to me being like, how do you do this? And so there's definitely something cooking about
I think I knew that in my heart, but I had never named it. Because everything is like that now, right? Interesting, right? It's the non-Catholic hippies who want NFP.
which is
Yeah,
great.
yeah,
Which is,
right.
I have no interest in doing things on brand. Like,
Yeah, right.
you know, to me, if something is Catholic, it just means it's properly human.
Uh-huh.
And so I think it's properly human to not be controversial,
100%. Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So the entire psychodynamics between men and women were radically impacted by contraception. And even if you're a lover of it and you love contraception, you need to at least admit that fact.
Yeah, well, I think I had a conversation with a couple of my college classes this last semester. I don't know how we got to the topic, but I said, okay, you guys, do you think pornography would exist at the level it does today without contraception? There's no way. Absolutely no way. I mean,
But
pornography is almost
unpack that for us a
money.
little bit. How do you connect those dots so clearly? Like Jamie, said contraception, then she, hit it out of the park with the way she connected the two. Yep.
Um, if there's a
You're always
direct
good
line
on this,
from,
but it's clearer to you than it is to some of our listeners.
oh,
Say it. I'm
really?
sorry.
That's surprising. There's a
Yeah.
direct line from that to OnlyFans. I'm sorry. There
Right,
just
right, right.
is,
Yeah, yeah.
because and it's even surreal, even on Facebook, they're advertising this kind of stuff now, which is unbelievable. And I just saw something on Twitter or X yesterday. Somebody posted something like saying like I can't believe this happened. It was a stripper basically showing how much money she made every night. I worked last night, $3,000. Right? Talk about instrumentalization, right?
Yeah.
And you can't have you can't be that promiscuous with without contraception, without having a child,
Let's
right?
say feedback,
No way.
right?
Yeah.
Sterile sex leads to more in the uninitiated men. And
Mhm.
more uninitiated men will demand more sterile sex because they
Right.
won't want to father. And I mean father with a capital F, which means not just father, meaning siring a child. They don't want to
Mhm.
work.
No,
They don't want to take care of things. They don't
well,
want to be a priest, provider, protector in any way.
they become completely infantilized,
Right.
and they sit
That's the
home
thing.
playing video games.
Like we said,
And you're
maturity
right.
is going to be the lattice work of this
And you're
conversation, right?
and you're
Maturity.
right
What does it
about
mean to be human and grow up?
not wanting to work. I know, like I live out here in the countryside in Michigan. One of my best friends is a logger. Um, a lot of people have their own businesses and stuff. Their biggest complaint is they can't find anybody who wants to work, and they're talking about men in particular. Doing logging, which is not easy work. But my friend Josh can't get anybody who lasts more than maybe a month,
Mm.
and it's too hard. And he pays them really well. You know.
Yeah. This is so Jamie and I also think slightly differently about some of these things. I mean, I think we have some like deep agreement, but this is I know this contraception point is very dear to you. And I guess for me, just to complicate it a little bit, or just to be the devil's advocate for a moment.
Jamie's
Um,
facial expression is so delightful.
I well, there's this part of this idea that Bly has, and that I think that a lot of people have is let's look to the past to see how men become men, right? Go from boys to men. And that's why we have this interest in the rites of passage and in initiation, which is a word that you'll see used all the time. Um, a lot of this, I mean, I'm no anthropologist, but I think it is tricky that a lot of the societies did not have like the sexual or marital ethics of the Catholic Church, right? There was a lot of infanticide. There were ways to prevent conception and birth, and very brutal things that happened in societies a long time ago too. Um, I absolutely think in our current configuration, it's totally a part of things, right? It's a huge ingredient in the current relation between the sexes, contraception. But I just think it's also there's a deep, long history of managing and getting rid of unwanted pregnancies and unwanted children, right? Way back into antiquity. And I think that that's just a brutal reality that was there too.
Mhm.
I think the porn thing is also to respond to that. I mean, I think that's a huge part. When that is now the kind of shadowy anti-initiation of every young man
Yeah.
into the sexual world, is to
Yeah.
see a woman who's probably been abused in her life get, in a very, it's a very bad training in what the relation between the sexes sexually is. And it is so pervasive. And like you're saying, normalized now, not normal, but it's regarded as something that's so unremarkable that it could just be advertised wherever. Um, and I do think that actually, from my experience, um, living and working and befriending people in all kinds of political and cultural spaces, I think there's a rising awareness of that. I think there's a sense of the darkness that is involved in that, and the pain that's involved in that was not really being talked about before. That's very much in the mainstream now too. There's documentaries that have been made. But that also is proceeding as a minority awareness along with the explosive growth of something like OnlyFans and the ongoing ubiquity of porn all over the place. So but yeah, I'd say that's a huge factor for men. I think that this because sex is such a power, right? And it's something that has such force. And so I think that it gets deformed early.
When I think to get even potentially more brutal, right, than even just our cultural history is just looking at our animal history, right? Which is that there's an economics of sex. That's reality, which is that we have the most vulnerable creature that is born to us when we pair up for sex. And my ability to take care of that creature is more dependent on your assistance than most animals. And so this sets up human psychology in a very interesting way. If we think about if we worked from that just bodily reality of what it means to be male and female, that when that's sort of taken out of the mix suddenly in our history, right? Contraception in our human history is very young in the widespread way that we're talking about. I mean, of course, you are absolutely right. There's always been ways of regulating pregnancy.
Yeah, what I guess I would want to say is if the premise was that there's something really disordered or confused about masculinity, well, I'll leave femininity to the side because it's not today's topic. But I would say that I'm totally open to that being a strand within it. I just think it's more complicated than that. I think that there's a lot of I think I would want to include other things, not to throw too much into the pot all at once, but weakened bonds with our fathers because they're all out at work, and that we don't really grow up in a family unit. Just the rites of passage thing I mentioned, the fear of expressiveness, the fears of one another that we have as men, the way that sport and work and violence and sex are all involved. So I think that there's just a lot of factors. I think there's a lot of things that give us this kind of vacuum of masculine meaning. And that's, I think, it's just a lot. Yeah.
In that area, you could say, David is saying there's a constellation of factors, and nobody heard Jamie saying it's the only factor too, but it was also like that thing. But, I've had so many different jobs associated with the Catholic Church, but I still think I'm a campus minister in one sense. And I think too, if maybe the difference between like a Cartesian and a Goethean worldview here is that, students would come into my office and, embarrassed to think of the way I began. They'd be sleeping with their boyfriend, and that's not right or something. And then their expressions on their faces showed me, well, that's not helping this conversation. But so I found ways of becoming better in conversation, never losing touch of the person in front of me. But then, and even this might sound brutal, but when it arises in conversation, the same thing of like premarital sex and contraception, you put it in a dynamic view as opposed to a static, a thou shalt not, the William Blake thing. And you can get both parties to see that contracepting against a certain background, it tends to work against itself. So they're dating, the first date, you're sleeping together. Well, oh gosh, he's probably not going to bring you flowers anymore. Or you've been just dating for a few weeks. But then, when that love has grown so much, if that consummation is something, of a reflection of something that's been pre-existing, but to bring in those developments, and again, contracepting a young couple nervous, or a young married couple just got married, they're worried, neither of them have jobs. when you put it against the background of what this looks like, that contracepting leads to a stronger likelihood of a culture of objectification. Then this allows kind of the people to make that decision, which helps them again grow up. Like hiding under the thou shalt nots, it could be right, but this maturity piece is something. So that was just a little bit of my experience, on that.
Well, interesting that you say that because I think it's clinically proven now that women on the pill get attracted to men that they wouldn't necessarily be attracted to off the pill, and probably the soft male version of the male is what they get attracted to, and then they get off and like, who are you? What am I doing here? How did I get here?
And I
Um,
think it's actually,
Is
it's
that a
not.
real phenomenon then?
oh
Definitely.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, it is. It is.
Wow.
There's
Okay, that's good.
research around that. And I don't think it's the softness, Michael. It's the lack of integration of the softness with masculinity, with something else, and to me, maybe we can talk about then what is a healthy masculinity. And we could all think about that a little bit, but at
Mhm.
the very least, to me, a healthy masculinity, I really like the Robert Bly idea of, or is it Robert Johnson, priest, warrior, magician, lover. I think that that's wonderful. I think that that's a really good start. There's another kind of, triune of ideas that came more through church formation often, which is priest, provider, protector.
Yeah, that's what you're thinking of. It's a king, warrior, magician, lover is the name of a famous book about these major masculine
Yeah.
archetypes, right? And then yeah, you do often hear, I think, in Christian circles, that priest, provider, protector triad of things that a man should embody.
And now we're in the archetypes, right? These are all archetypes in a kind of a Jungian language. And in a Jungian language, the idea is we have the ability to be consciously possessed by an archetype. So meaning that we are aware of embodying this particular medicine, not in a self-conscious awareness, but that we are aware. And in Christian language, I almost feel like it's like when we are imbued with the Holy Spirit, right? When we are able to be a kind of minister of grace in some way to another person. So this is really an idea of healthy masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this, to be a minister of grace to somebody else, what it implies is this fundamental tenderness and respect of the recipient. And so then I, as the feminine or the recipient, the person in the receiving position, I have to have some sense of my own dignity, not because I'm some big diva, but because everyone is dignified.
Well said.
Everybody in their healthy feminine is worthy and actually dignified beyond their wildest dreams, right? So these ideas to me are these healthy masculinity ideas. For me, they're inextricable from, in our culture, Christ. That's our divine masculine image that, whether we are happy with it or not, we are working with here in the West primarily. That's been the biggest collective archetypal stream of projections onto a figure, even if we're a non-believer. And so there's a lot to contend with and think about in terms of this dynamic of masculine and feminine with Christ, and then all of the feminine figures that he encounters.
Right. Now it's interesting now you say that. Now I think for the longest time in Western culture, especially American culture, the masculine was under attack. I mean, just a few years ago, well, even when I was a Waldorf teacher 20 years ago, people were trying to introduce non-competitive games.
Right.
Like that's going to solve anything. The only thing it solved was none of the kids wanted to play them. And then they were worried about toxic masculinity, right? Which was a big buzzword, right?
Yeah.
And but then, and so for the longest time, I mean, that was like the sitcom dad, right? Dad's an idiot. He's the butt of all of our jokes, it was almost like a political program, to emasculate the masculine, over a generation and or two. And just in the last few years, this which I think that was like, well, mission accomplished. Let's focus on the feminine. Let's destroy that, right? Which is to me is what I've been watching unfold is kind of unbelievable. I mean, I think I published the Submerged Reality 8 years ago, 9 years ago, something like that. And 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 since that time, and I it just came up just the other day. So somebody wrote a review of my edition of uh Novalis' Christendom or Europe. And one of the comments in the review said, "What was it? Isn't the problem we have too much of the feminine?"
Mm.
And which was, I'm like, and I'm thinking to myself, well, they're both so, you know, destroyed. Their images are, and both
They're
are so destroyed.
interdependently injured. They're
Yes.
interdependently harmed, and they interdependently rise.
But I think
right?
Yeah, right. Yep.
is what you're referring to, Michael, the sort of thing that like this, I know now a long-standing kind of conservative Christian worry about like the feminization of an emasculation of the church and of Christian. I mean, that's now a battle cry that's more than 150 years old, right? There was a concern about that among Victorians, I think, that Christian masculinity was already something that needed to be shored up and defined better and defended. But is that the kind of thing that's like, is that so the people who say there's too much of the feminine would be the people who say, well, look, that's why the churches are emptying of men and that sort of thing?
I don't know where this guy was coming from, but
Okay.
I think the point I'm trying to make is that what people don't see, or at least it seems to me, is that I think there are spiritual forces at work trying to destroy both.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And the family as well. I mean, they're and kind of a flattening. I mean, when they say, the weird thing this actually happened. So this last semester in school, I was teaching a lot of freshmen. I said, oh, and it just occurred to me one day. I said, hey, do you guys, who knows when the American Civil War happened? Nobody could tell me. Nobody could tell me. The closest guess I had was 1600s.
Okay, but you could, Michael, that's
But wait, I'm not done.
okay, go.
But they could tell me how many genders there are, and it wasn't two. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, which to me suggests that there has been, I mean, it's a spiritual problem. It's a spiritual problem that is disfiguring when the Sophianic, which is the real, right? I mean, Sophia is not necessarily, I mean, Sophia is certainly feminine, but Sophia is the metaxu, that the between that allows us to see what the real is.
Mm-hmm.
And that, and there's a hostility to that, and there's a hostility to the masculine and to the feminine, which is, I think, unparalleled or in history. I don't think there's ever been a time in world history where both the masculine and the feminine have been under direct spiritual attack as it is right now.
Well, I was journaling actually before this call, and I can read the short passages I wrote about each, about to me what would these interdependent feminine and masculine be. And you can hear that these are things that are both under attack. That one of the things that I wrote about the masculine way of knowing is that the masculine way of knowing is it's outer, it's omniscient, it's the archetype demonstrated in God the Father. It is the ability to clearly see. It gives the possibility for the I thou experience. It's the ability to have a wholly omniscient third person perspective. And the feminine, on the other hand, is this deep first person perspective. It's immanence, right? It is the kind of it's like the perfume of God's breath. I love thinking of it that way, or the warmth of a candle. And it's this all-encompassing radiating quality. And that kind of subtlety, that sort of tender appreciation of beauty that is deeply under attack in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
That ability to kind of receive in that way is really being killed by technology. I mean, by the way we receive information being very different than through the senses and the breath and the whole body. That to me is the receptive, very embodied feminine experience. And pure truth, rationality, and objectivity is also under attack. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think you're right on there that because they provide for each other,
Well,
right?
and the other thing, I mean, the other thing our culture tries to tell us is that there's no difference between the male and female,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
that so therefore male and female psychology are not different, and I know they are. I mean, whether we want to go biologically and say, well, males have their sexual organs outside of the body, and women have theirs on the inside of the body, or as Joseph Campbell, I think it was him, somebody said, in primitive societies, men do the hunting and women set the traps. Okay.
That's Tomberg. That's
That's the idea.
Tomberg. Yeah.
But the point, what I'm getting at, so, and I found this out as a school teacher, so I kind of specialized in teaching Waldorf middle grades, like 6th through 8th. And they'd always put me in there because a lot of teachers get terrified when the kids start talking back when they're 12. And I'm like, put me in, man. Just send me in. And and the funny thing is these boys would be ripping on each other and teasing each other, and they do it to the girls, and the girls would cry. And so I had to have a meeting with the boys. I said, boys, they are not like us. Okay. You can talk to that way to boys, but you can't talk the way to girls. It just doesn't work. And that was probably the fruit of there was a book we were selling in the bookstore at the school, which I never bought, but there were a set of books, How to Raise a Daughter, How to Raise a Son, and by a husband and wife. They were probably therapists. But I opened it up, and the only sentence I read, which I have has been almost a guiding rail in my school when I was a school teacher and as a father, is that the sentence was something along the lines of um, to be a good parent, you need to know two things: that girls thrive when they know they're safe and protected, and boys thrive when they know you know what you're talking about.
And
Or they
that's
can,
really good.
Summary.
which is, and I said, well, that kind of works, and I know it works because that's how I raised. I mean, I that's kind of been behind my mind with raising my kids, and I know that with how many students I've taken through school in the hundreds, and that I mean that principle seems to work, and so I always strove to let the girls feel secure and the boys, that I knew what I was talking about, and it made them feel secure that I knew what I was talking about, right? So they could trust me as an authority, right? And the girls knew I wasn't going to let anything happen to them,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, yeah, but if you were to say that in most contemporary intellectual circles, you'd be shot down. As that's kind of somehow heretical and not obvious to the senses.
Mm-hmm.
The whole to bring in, there's a few things that occur to me, but even the Ivan Illich book Gender, he sets up this idea, that there's war on gender to begin with. So there's the male and the female. But there's still, I think we need to keep almost another lens that has a primacy for what can be revealed about our times through the primacy of this lens. Sophia versus Ahriman, or the technocracy versus the divine feminine, Mary versus the dragon, nested loops and things like that. But for the divine, the war on women, yes, connected to the environmental, when you mentioned that piece, Jamie. And then, that Illich said that, it was the Industrial Revolution, was the first time that labor, that the toolbox was the same. You're on one side of the assembly line, and the only difference was the bulge in those similar clothing like jeans that you were wearing. But this whole ecology of gender evaporated when people thought, because he thought gender was defined and I've said this on the show before, this wonderful image, because I find it so fructifying, is, there was a toolbox. There was an asymmetrical line that ran through every toolbox, that in one alpine village, the women might milk the goats, but they would never milk the cows. That was men's work. Women might use a certain instrument, aside for the wheat, but the men would use a different one. And it could just be different. Then later, women with machines and so forth, they were more prone in proximity to young ones, to be closer to the kids. The men were prone to go farther. But and what he called was the dance of genders. And I guess the last time I spoke, I was talking about like a dynamic way of understanding it as opposed to a static. For me, is everything. Every time we hear something, and Jamie's been very eloquent that, the regnant masculinity forms the regnant femininity and vice versa. And so when you were talking about, Michael, the Civil War date, all I can do then is cringe on the other side and say that, like, literally, that's not a problem for every young man entering the Catholic Church today, or the fewer that remain there. They all know the Civil War date, but they don't know how to talk to a woman,
But also very few
yeah.
women are now raised to comfortably say, and I don't mean this is just for Catholics, I mean, period.
Yeah, right.
Say, my relationship with my body looks like this. I am not going to pollute my body with contraception. I am a perfectly healthy ecological being. And I am open to having as many children as I would like. And my expectation is that you support me while I do that forever.
That's great.
That's basic.
Uh-huh.
That should not be extra.
Yeah, right.
That should not be, this is basic formation before you get to date me.
Wow.
Yep. That's
And
right. Yep.
that is missing altogether. And then we can talk about our personality and compatibility and all of that other stuff and what are we both interested in. But are you with me with that plan for my sovereign body?
Right.
Yeah.
For life.
And that's something that's been lost to a great degree in contemporary sexual ethics. And which one of my friends, one of my colleagues when I was a Waldorf teacher, is the gym teacher, really super funny guy. But he had two daughters, and he told me something which I've used ever since. And because he was a jock, right? So he said, I always tell my daughters, the woman is like the pitcher in the baseball game. She decides how fast the game goes.
Right.
Right. And I tell my daughters the same thing, right? Which I think it's good advice. And I told college students the same story a million times, because people don't, I think a lot of women don't think they have, especially young women, don't think they have agency in that regard.
Because they've forgotten they're an animal.
Yes.
It's really just that simple. It's like we could put two cow, you're a farmer, right? I'm not a farmer, I'm a New Yorker, but I know this enough. If I put a pen of one female animals ovulating next to a pen of other male animals, there's a certain dynamic that's going to happen.
Yeah. And stay out of the way, right?
Right. And so the whole interdependence of ecology and psychology and male-female relationships and technology, right? These are all interdependent things. So a healthy masculinity, to circle back, to me begins with a steward of what is ecological. And I, as a female, am included. And so is in what is ecological. But I am at the top of kind of the, in California language, we call it the manifestation game, which is the ability to bring another human being into the world, from a Christian perspective, an eternal soul. All daughters need to remember this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that this is actually then what invites men to say, and when I say that as many children are going to come as I can possibly welcome, and I believe in you to be able to take care of all of us. What does that do? That ideally to a man, that feels like, here I go. But what's happening in our culture that makes that be like, oh, hell no, I don't want anything to do with that. And I I mean, you guys would be better to speak to that than me. But what do you think makes that? I mean, to me, it's just the promise of free sex, if I'm really honest, that
Mhm.
when somebody could just have contraceptive sex without responsibility, who would pick me with all these expectations? But maybe there's more.
One thing, just very briefly, that again, it kind of comes from a campus ministry piece is, the role of the provider there, Jamie, is that, when you're talking to all these women, they seem, and again, a polarized culture, kind of binary thinking. I could, for, way too shorthand, kind of divide for the women, the men into, you'd have a guy whose dad ran a nice accounting firm. The guy was in the accounting department. He was a student. He was going to be good. So you knew you had security. And you could be drawn to that security, but you're repulsed by something else, not repulsed, but, you didn't see a sense of excitement or creativity there necessarily. Then reacting from that, they would always go for like the dude bro who didn't even have a work ethic, right? But was edgy outside. And I always try to say like the in-between is the poet, the guy who has dreams and you might have to take a journey with him, but will have 5 jobs if he needs to get bread on the table, right? And you need the eye for that guy. But running from the guy who's got it all figured out, inheriting the family business,
Mhm.
to the guy who's got nothing figured out, there again, that's that notion of maturation into the poet, realizing those things, and I think the Catholic Church, we need a better masculinity, in the area of pornography.
And we need better
Uh,
poetry. Yeah.
yeah, you have within our diocese, you have some groups, and it reminded me of the old Promise Keepers movement. That at one level, my friends were associated with that. You got to go to what was in our area of the country, formerly Rich Stadium of the Buffalo Bills, and bang on drums and say, "I'm going to love my wife like crazy" for the next month. And your reward was to get back to that male bonding experience with the drums, and the the idea of you know, we're always, again, it's just all these things we see vacillating. Oh, but I'm sorry, with the pornography piece. So you have some churches that are doing equivalents like that. You get men together and say, like, together with our solidarity, we will slay the demon of
Mhm.
pornography. And then other groups are working through the 12-step model. And my heart guide
Yeah.
kind of goes to the other group, coming to terms with their
Well,
humanity, you know.
well, you saw this. I mean, you mentioned, you know, Robert Bly and then the Promise Keepers. And then there was a recent thing that Jonathan Pageau did with a bunch of, it was a very butch kind of Christian thing. And the Ortho Bros are big on this, right? But I mean,
Yeah.
I think what happens is those kinds of things, they're almost like flash in the pans in a way. And they can't, there's nothing to ground them in. They don't get roots. They kind of burn and wither. It's a nice idea, but it's kind of gimmicky and it's not grounded in a reality. It's performative. You know what I mean?
Also
Um,
othering. It's not looking at my own unhealthy
right,
sexuality, which we all have, that wants to instrumentalize other people, including me, including everyone. That's
right.
our human thing to work with,
Well,
and says, let's go against them who do it.
yeah.
Right.
Also, I mean, I would say to those archetypal images that we referred to earlier, like the king, warrior, magician, lover thing, there's dark versions of all of those too, right? So
Very.
there's this, and I think that is, then they're very powerful, right? When I see like there a lot of the sort of like young right-wing Christians on X that you're referring to, Michael, like
Yeah.
Mhm.
there's a sense I get from a lot of these kids who are these like 18-year-olds who believe that the throne of Peter is empty, the see of Peter is empty. They've become like the most vociferous right-wing Catholics from their living room, on the computer, or
Yeah.
kids
Mhm.
who have fantasies of storming Constantinople to take it back from the Turks with their balaclava masks on. Right? These like
Yep.
really deranged warrior fantasies, and
It's
but
huge. It's huge.
they're dressed up in all the power of religious symbolism too. I feel
Cosplay.
really mentally diseased, a lot of it.
Dangerous.
And I was
Dangerous.
there was a time in my life where I was somewhat vulnerable to that too. I was attracted to the most traditionalist forms of religious life, And a lot of that had to do with fear for me and a dislike for the messiness and uncertainty of the world that we're in now. I mean, if there's one thing that I'd like to get in for today, that just as a
Sure.
view that I think is important, is that whatever it is, I think the vision for masculinity today should just be about a, a, a kind of retrieval of the best of the past and acknowledging that the past was always messed up. That there is the deep ancient tribal and village past was messed up in some ways. The 1950s repressed square past was messed up. Then there were wounds from the 60s and 70s and the directions that men went there. And I feel like to kind of to dream this onwards and to have like a new version of masculinity is going to be this integrating of the best of that stuff and not idealizing too much. Because I think what I see on, let's say, both the let's say more new age or more psychedelic or more like kind of nouveau spiritual California set, there's a lot of idealization of the ancient past, right? They had it right with that indigenous people were great, and it's just been a downhill slope ever since.
A great
or that on the other hand, you've got the people who say, if it just weren't for the complete dissolution of everything good in the 60s, we would all be okay. Right. We would have our families, we would have our children back. And I think that it's just not that simple. And I would say that that's something that I think we do have in common. I mean, like both Jamie and I are not interested in party lines. And we both don't occupy any like neat political space, where we're like, that's our home turf. But yeah, that's one thing I would say about like what, at least for me, and I'm just some guy. I mean, I'm just
hey, some guy. I think what you just described reminds me of, which is over the years has grown to be more and more an important work of literature for me, which is the Mort d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory, which is he kind of compiled the whole Arthurian Grail stuff and put it all into one box. But the whole thing is, you see how fragile the good is through there, the fragility of the good, because from the beginning, you start reading the book, that Camelot's going to fall apart. It's all going to be a disaster. Things are going to go wrong. But Rex Quandam Rex Futurus, the once and future king, right? That you kind of hold on to the good, that which is, to me, in a way, that becomes a brutally honest work of literature, because because if things go bad doesn't mean there wasn't any good, right?
Well, this is
go ahead, Jamie.
Go ahead, Mike. I've been working with this image lately of, the Japanese art kintsugi, where you break a pot.
Oh yes, I do. Okay.
Put it back together, and where all the wounds were in the pot, you embellish in gold.
Right.
To me, this is like the fundamental Christian image, which is that everything that is broken into a further beauty and into a further healing and into a further revelation. So all of this lament that we have about all of this brokenness in terms of masculinity or the world or whatever, it's tremendous opportunity, right? So the question that then is asked, I think, of all of us is like, how do we be that gold? Right? How do we go back and now repair this brokenness in a way that says, okay, the wound that happened around masculinity in the 1960s taught us this. And so we need to embellish this here and remember this. And that I don't like kind of all is lost stories either. That I wouldn't be a therapist.
Yeah.
Just too sad, that and I just don't think I'd be a Christian. I think it's like, as much as I'm constantly trying to leave, in a way, I'm constantly trying to not be a Christian, in the sense of that it makes me homeless everywhere, as a therapist, especially in Southern California, it's not the easiest thing to occupy as part of my identity. And nevertheless, this very redemptive image, right? This kind of kintsugi Jesus is what I think ultimately divine masculinity is all about, which is how do we be good steward? How do we repair? How do we heal? How do we learn? How do we transmit a knowledge, right? So, yeah, thanks.
And Jamie, because all I was going to say is and I think that's the best definition. When I said like the poet, that's kind of it. And we need to go back to the Gospels. Like, what is it that makes them unique? If we want to even claim in some way prima, alter pares, that we have something unique in Jesus. I still think it would be not confusing means and ends, right? So the king, the once and future king, we have so many people, some young men, because we don't have an image of the future king. But all I know in my heart is the future king can't look like the previous king, guys. What is it going to look like? Now, Jesus Christ is king. We were talking about the dangerous masculinity last week on this podcast a little bit. And I like that word, but a big word for me is courage, right? Because, if you look at the gospel of my youngest son who's visiting today, his middle name is Courage. Women have all these great virtue names like Faith and Hope and everything. His name is Peter Courage. But and Owen Barfield once said, that each civilization has its own besetting sin and its own one needful thing. And the besetting sin would be this literalness we have, and that the one needful thing could be courage. But so there's a lot of masculinity that you could tie to Jesus, tie to not confusing means and ends, tied to the equality of all souls. Like you said, this image, Jamie, it's because it's the dignity in every person and so forth.
And
but,
Mike, what you just hit so perfectly
mm-hmm.
is this is that masculine and feminine, because the heart of the word courage is cur.
Right. Heart.
It's like, so a man
mm-hmm.
fully in touch with his heart,
mm-hmm.
there's the lion, right? Yeah. There's that, but that's where I think this kind of men's work comes into the mix. And that's where I think psychology does come into the mix, because we have a lot of healing to do
mm-hmm.
internally, not just out there.
Right.
Internally.
Begin here, we say in the Christian one. Reform is reform of yourself so that it might pulsate out to the world. It's not about going back to the heroic age and conquering, and transforming by might this world, right?
Well, that's, when they would dub a knight, the thing they would say, in the name of God, St. Michael and St. George, I give you the power to meet justice. Right. And there's in the whole idea of chivalry, which we don't have to get into it too much, but the whole idea, even though it never, the ideal was never achieved or rarely achieved, was basically to incarnate that kind of divine masculine in the world, right? I've been mentioning that I've been praying Psalm 82 every morning. The first thing I do, I come in this room and I look out that way because it's easy to look at the sun and say, God standeth in the congregation of the mighty. He judgeth amongst the gods. How long will you judge them justly and accept the persons of the wicked? Defend the poor and fatherless, deliver the poor and needy, do justice to the afflicted and needy, rid them out of the hand of the wicked, right? That's, I say that to myself to remind me of my job,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think and if we don't have a sense of the divine, we can't have a sense of the masculine or the feminine.
No.
Boy,
here's a question.
Oh, go ahead. A whole other conversation. Yeah.
A question for both of you. If we want to say, so I use as shorthand, there's this wonderful true rock musician who kind of had an evangelical conversion. His name is Tony O'Kay. Who takes their rock name from a Thomas Mann novel? This guy does. But we need genius guy. But shorthand, when he looked at the genders, he said, just in a line in one song, it's not big for him. Women get cold, men never grow up. And I go, whoa, that's pretty cool, right? The idea that women will kind of necessarily mature. But, if we were to try to help the culture along, one thing I see amongst men is that I'll say in campus ministry, maybe 15 years ago, you stopped seeing men and women look like they were having fun together, like holding hands on campus, I don't know, especially on a spring
so rare
day.
to see that now.
Yeah. And then you'd see women graduating and saying, it's not that I didn't meet a boyfriend, but like nobody even asked me out for coffee. Now you ask the women and they say, I haven't even met a grown-up. But men don't know. So, if we're talking about masculinity, one way to help men is men don't know what women mean when they say he's not a grown-up. We just don't know it.
Because
And I think
women
having kids
don't know from the yeah.
say more. But yeah, but so like if men could understand whether it's almost like when we use the word cosplay, they're just trying on costumes to think, so this heroic stuff. But if a main one would be that, men, they haven't met a grown-up, how does a woman know that we don't know about ourselves? It's almost like we're going to ask.
Because if my fertility is not in the mix, I'm not a grown-up.
Interesting. Yep.
Right? I'm sterile. I'm in the place my body was when I was a little girl. And so this is really important. It's not that I'm even if I wasn't Catholic, it's more a psychological phenomenon that I think can happen for men and women with sterilization, because I think that our fertility initiates us into our adulthood. I don't think that's Catholic. I think that that's like not even maybe unique to our species.
It's true.
Right? And so that it's again, parallel process. That if I'm not initiated into my mature body, I'm not going to have the expectations of a mature woman, and vice versa, that they're interdependent.
Right. And I think that's interesting. I'm glad you used the word fertility, because I also think that, and I've watched this, and as a farmer, I'm intimately involved with fertility, and I have 9 kids, but that we live in a world that is hostile to fertility, right? Birth rates, we have to get the population down, right? Or, with animals or whatever it happens to be, there is, even with the war on farming that's going on right now, it's symbolically a war on fertility, or on flourishing, on human,
100%.
on life, the flourishing of life.
What does that say about the state of our soul?
Yeah.
Like, I can't imagine any other creatures coming together and saying, how do we get as few of us as possible? It's a dark thing,
It's a very, very dark thing.
So I know we're at time, I think, right? Stop.
But interesting. Well, this is seminal stuff, to use another gendered term. I remember hearing that until again, I'll go back to Ivan Illich, but testimony is a very gendered term too. Like a man used to say, on the cusp of marriage, you gave testimony. You couldn't necessarily sign, but you held your junk and you said, like, on these, I put my name down, and but so yeah, this was a fascinating conversation. How can we promote your work, Jamie and David? Are there links you have so much wisdom to share?
Well, why don't we'll come back sometime. We'll talk about just the feminine.
Yeah. I would love it.
It's hard. These are topics.
We could be here for hours.
I feel like, just that one nugget about chivalry. We could have talked about that chivalry, because one thing that you didn't mention explicitly, but it's implicit in that word, is also about how that relates to the honor and veneration and defense of a woman, right? Which is a big theme there. And then the point about our God image, our gendered God images, right? Of a divine mother, a divine father.
Let's do it again, and not in the far too distant future. Because again, because we talk about the divine feminine, but implicit in everything said is we need to be clarifying the masculine and all the time, or again, it becomes kind of atrophied and is more prone to disease. So, well, thank you both so much, Michael. Good luck farming this weekend. Or no, you're going to be making your ginger beer.
Well, that takes an hour. Okay.
Oh.
I'll be farming. In fact, I'm going out to finish with potatoes right now.
All right, I'm going to go see my family and begin the weekend of Memorial Day. Thanks for listening to the Regeneration Podcast, everyone. Yep.
Love you both.
Thank you. Love you.